I built a home with my own hands and filled it with love for my son. Days before his wedding, his fiancée looked me in the eye and said, "This house is wasted on you." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I packed my things, and when I left, I wasn't alone and I wasn't empty-handed. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, please leave a comment, and subscribe to my YouTube. I've always believed that a house is more than walls and wood. It's the place where you keep your promises, where you leave the light on even when you're tired, where you forgive before you're asked. I raised my son in that belief. Every night I tucked him in, every scraped knee I kissed, every report card I praised or worried over, I did it under this roof. The house stood with me through widowhood, through lean years, through the quiet loneliness that comes when a child grows and needs you less. Still, I kept the rooms ready. Family comes home. That was my rule. My son, Daniel, was my pride. He had his father's steady hands and my habit of listening before speaking. When he brought Mara into our lives, I told myself to open the door wide. She was beautiful in a sharp, polished way, always dressed as if she had an appointment with someone important. She laughed easily, but not kindly. I noticed that early on, though I tried to ignore it. I wanted my son happy. I wanted to believe love smooths rough edges. They moved in temporarily, they said, just until the wedding. I rearranged my life to make space. I turned my sewing room into a guest room. I cooked meals that fit Mara's preferences, learned to season food lighter, to buy sparkling water instead of tea. I paid the utilities without complaint when the bills doubled. I told myself it was an investment in family, the kind you don't expect returns on. At first, Mara thanked me. Then she corrected me. Then she dismissed me. It was small things, a sigh when I spoke, an eye roll when I asked about plans. She called the living room dated and suggested renovations that cost more than my annual income. Daniel would laugh it off, squeeze my shoulder, say she meant well. I wanted to believe him. The wedding crept closer and the house changed. Boxes stacked in the hallway, dress bags hung from door frames. Mara's voice filled every room. She spoke about their future as if I were furniture, useful until replaced. I told myself not to be sensitive. This was a stressful time. Brides get anxious. Mothers learn to step back. The day everything broke was a Tuesday. Quiet and gray. I remember because I had just washed the windows and the world looked clearer than it had in weeks. Mara was on the phone in the kitchen pacing, her heels clicking like a metronome of impatience. I tried to pass through with a basket of laundry, but she didn't move. She ended the call sharply and looked at me, her smile thin. "You know," she said, glancing around, "this house is wasted on you." The words landed like a plate shattering on tile. I felt the sound before the meaning. I asked her to repeat herself softly because sometimes cruelty hides behind misunderstanding. She didn't hesitate. "You heard me. Daniel and I need space, light, modern things. This place," she waved her hand as if brushing crumbs off a counter, "it's too much for one person. It doesn't make sense." I waited for Daniel to say something. He stood there, leaning against the doorframe, his expression careful, practiced. He didn't disagree. He didn't defend me. He just didn't meet my eyes. In that moment, a lifetime rearranged itself inside me. I saw the late nights, the sacrifices, the way I had folded myself smaller to keep peace. I felt the old ache of being useful only when convenient. I also felt something else, quiet and steady, like a hand on my back, dignity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I set the laundry down and said, "I hear you." Mara's eyebrows lifted, surprised. Perhaps she expected tears or anger. I offered neither. I went to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and breathed until my hands stopped shaking. Then I opened my desk drawer and took out a folder I hadn't touched in years. You see, the house wasn't a gift. It wasn't a bargaining chip. It was mine, paid for, maintained, insured. The deed was clear. I had never made a show of it because love doesn't need receipts. But love also doesn't mean surrender. That evening, I called my sister Ruth. She listened without interrupting, the way she always had. When I finished, she said, "Come stay with me. Not because you're running, but because you're choosing." I slept lightly that night, the house creaking as it always had, familiar and faithful. In the morning, I made coffee and watched the sun move across the floor. I felt sadness, yes, but not defeat. When Daniel came in, I told him I'd be away for a while. He asked how long. I said, long enough to remember who I am. I packed a single suitcase. I left the rest where it was. At the door, I turned and looked at the walls that had heard my prayers and my laughter. I whispered, "Thank you." Then I stepped out, not alone, but accompanied by something I hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. Ruth's house smelled like lavender and old books, the kind of place where time softened instead of sharpened. She didn't ask me to explain again. She made soup, poured tea, and let the quiet do its work. That first night, I slept deeply, the kind of sleep you only get when your heart finally unclenches. In the morning, sunlight spilled across the quilt, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't dread the day ahead. Word traveled faster than I expected. Daniel called that afternoon, his voice cautious, like someone testing ice before stepping on it. He asked why I'd left without a conversation. I told him I had listened clearly enough. He said Mara hadn't meant it the way it sounded. I asked him how it was supposed to sound when someone told you your life was a waste. He was silent then, and in that silence I heard all the answers I needed. I didn't rush back. I took walks with Ruth, cooked meals slowly, remembered how it felt to move at my own pace. But I wasn't hiding. I was preparing. I made appointments, one with my lawyer, another with the bank, not out of spite, out of responsibility. If I was going to step aside, it would be on my terms, not because someone pushed me out. The lawyer confirmed what I already knew. The house was mine, fully and legally. There were no tenant rights issues to worry about because I had never charged rent, never formalized anything. Generosity, it turns out, can be undone with clarity. I drafted a simple notice, polite and firm, giving Daniel and Mara time to find their own place. I didn't tell Ruth everything right away. I wanted my resolve to settle first. When I returned to the house to collect more things, the air felt different. Boxes had multiplied. My favorite chair had been moved to make space for a rack of shoes. I stood in the doorway and felt like a guest in my own life. Mara looked up from her phone and smiled as if nothing had happened. She asked if I had a nice little break. I told her I had. I handed Daniel the envelope. He frowned, confused, then read it. His face drained of color. Mara laughed, short and sharp, until she realized I wasn't joking. She asked if this was some kind of threat. I told her it was a boundary. The argument that followed was loud but brief. I didn't match their volume. I didn't justify myself. I repeated one sentence, calmly like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog. This is my home, and I'm choosing how it's used. Daniel pleaded, Mara accused. I stayed steady. Neighbors noticed the moving trucks a week later. Whispers followed, as they always do. Some asked me if I was okay. I told them the truth, that I was better than okay. I was honest. That surprised them. Mara's image began to crack in ways I hadn't anticipated. Wedding vendors called me by mistake, asking about payments and changes she'd promised without funds to back them up. When I redirected them to Daniel, the confusion multiplied. It turns out entitlement doesn't manage logistics very well. The lavish plans shrank quickly. The guest list tightened. Smiles grew brittle. Daniel came to Ruth's one evening, alone. He looked tired, older. He asked me why I hadn't told him how hurt I was earlier. I told him I had in 100 quiet ways, and that love shouldn't require translation. He cried then, the first time I'd seen him do so since he was a boy. I held his hand, but I didn't pull him back to the life he had chosen. Some lessons have to be walked through, not carried. The wedding went on, smaller and less certain. I didn't attend. I sent a card wishing them clarity and kindness. I meant it. Afterward, I finalized my plans. I sold the house, not in haste, but with intention, to a young family who saw its worth immediately. I downsized to a place filled with light and silence and possibility. Ruth helped me hang my pictures. We laughed more than we cried. Mara never apologized. Daniel did eventually, not with excuses, but with understanding. We are rebuilding something quieter now, slower, based on respect rather than expectation. I don't compete with his choices anymore. I honor my own. I learned that dignity doesn't announce itself. It packs a suitcase, makes a phone call, and walks forward. Leaving didn't mean losing, it meant choosing myself, and in doing so, I found companions I hadn't known I had, truth, strength, and a future that fits me perfectly.
After the wedding, there was a stretch of silence that felt both heavy and merciful. No calls, no messages, no forced smiles across kitchen counters. Just space. I didn't realize how much of my energy had been spent bracing myself until I no longer had to. My new apartment was small but bright, the windows facing east so the mornings came gently. I arranged my furniture with intention, not to impress anyone, not to accommodate anyone else's taste. Every object had a reason. Every corner felt earned. I began to notice things again, the sound of birds arguing over crumbs on the balcony, the comfort of making dinner for one without apologizing for it, the way my shoulders sat lower now, as if they had finally accepted they no longer needed to carry everyone else. I volunteered at the local library twice a week, reading to children whose parents worked late shifts. Their questions were earnest and unfiltered, and in their presence, I remembered how important it is to be seen without being judged. Daniel reached out sporadically at first, a text asking how I was, a photo of a plant he'd bought saying it reminded me of my garden. I replied kindly, but briefly. I wasn't withholding love, I was teaching him how to approach it with care. One evening, he asked if we could meet. I suggested a cafe halfway between our lives, neutral ground. He arrived early and stood when he saw me, a habit from childhood that softened something in my chest. We talked about small things first, work, weather, books. Then he apologized again, more clearly this time. He said he hadn't understood how silence could be as sharp as words. He said he was learning the difference between loyalty and fear. I listened. I didn't rush to forgive, not because I was bitter, but because forgiveness is most meaningful when it's honest. Mara didn't come up until the end. When she did, Daniel didn't defend her. He spoke about tension, about control disguised as ambition, about how love had started to feel conditional. I didn't offer advice. I didn't say I told you so. I simply said, pay attention to how you feel when you're quiet. He nodded, as if that thought would stay with him. Months passed. My life filled in around me. I took a class in watercolor painting, something I'd always postponed. I made friends who knew me only as I was now, not as someone's mother or someone's fallback plan. There was freedom in that anonymity, in being chosen for who I was, not what I provided. Then one afternoon, a mutual acquaintance mentioned Mara's name with a sympathetic tilt of the head. I didn't ask for details, but they came anyway. The marriage was strained, promises had been made that couldn't be kept. The version of herself she presented so carefully had started to slip, especially when there was no one left to blame. I felt no triumph in hearing this, only a quiet confirmation that truth, when ignored, eventually speaks louder. Daniel visited again, this time with a tentative hope in his eyes. He said they were considering counseling. He said he was trying to rebuild trust, not just with me, but with himself. I told him I was proud of him for asking hard questions. We walked along the river, the water moving steadily beside us, indifferent to our human dramas. One day, I drove past my old house. New curtains hung in the windows, toys lay scattered on the lawn. I didn't stop, but I smiled. The house was no longer mine, but the love I'd poured into it hadn't vanished. It had simply changed hands, found new voices. I carried the best parts with me. I understand now that leaving wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of alignment. I chose a life that didn't require me to shrink. I chose peace over proximity. And in doing so, I modeled something I hope Daniel carries forward, that self-respect is not selfish and love should never cost you your voice. When I think back to the words that cut me, I no longer feel their sting. They revealed more than they wounded. My life is not wasted. It is intentional, resilient, and full, and I am not alone. I walk with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who I am and what I deserve. There's a particular kind of strength that grows after you stop explaining yourself. It doesn't announce itself. It settles into your bones and changes how you stand, how you listen, how you decide. I felt it most on ordinary days, when nothing dramatic happened and yet everything felt different. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. I no longer anticipated disappointment as if it were inevitable. Peace, I learned, is not loud, but it is consistent. Daniel and I began a new rhythm. We spoke once a week, sometimes more, sometimes less. He didn't come to me for rescue anymore. He came to me to share. There's a difference. I could hear it in his voice, the way he took responsibility for his choices without placing the weight of them on my shoulders. When he talked about counseling, he didn't frame it as a fix for Mara. He framed it as work he needed to do on himself. That mattered. Mara, for her part, remained distant. She sent a brief message once, something about wanting to clear the air. I replied politely, without opening a door I wasn't ready to walk through. I wished her well. I meant it in the way you wish good weather on a stranger. Not invested, not resentful, simply detached. Some relationships are not meant to be repaired. They are meant to be released. I continued building a life that felt honest. I hosted small dinners in my apartment, nothing fancy, just good food and better conversation. Friends from the library came, neighbors I'd grown fond of, Ruth always. We talked about books and travel and aging and joy. No one criticized my curtains. No one treated my presence as optional. It was healing in ways I hadn't anticipated. One evening, Daniel showed up unexpectedly, his eyes red, his hands unsteady. He didn't ask to come in. He waited. I stepped aside. He sat at my small table and told me the truth I'd been bracing for. The marriage was unraveling. Counseling had revealed patterns neither of them could ignore. He wasn't asking me to take sides. He was asking me how to stay whole. I told him something my mother once told me, something I hadn't understood until now. You don't have to be right to be free. You just have to be honest. We sat in silence after that, the city humming outside my window. I made tea. He breathed. When he left, I didn't feel pulled back into chaos. I felt grounded. That surprised me.
It meant I had truly stepped out of the old role, the fixer, the absorber of pain. I could love him without losing myself. That was the inheritance I wanted to pass on. Weeks later, Daniel told me he'd moved out. The separation was quiet, respectful. There was sadness, yes, but also relief. He thanked me for not rescuing him, for letting him learn. I told him that was the hardest love I'd ever given. As for me, I began planning a trip I'd postponed for decades. Just a simple journey, a train ride through places I'd only read about. I packed lightly. I wrote in a journal each morning, noting not what I lacked, but what I noticed. A kindness from a stranger, a meal that surprised me, the way my reflection looked calmer now. On the last day of that trip, I sat by the water and thought about the woman I'd been in that house, folding herself around other people's expectations. I didn't judge her. She did the best she could with what she knew. But I also thanked her for stepping aside when it mattered, for making room for who I was becoming. I returned home, not to the old house, but to myself. That, I realized, was the real departure. And I wasn't alone because I carried my values with me, my boundaries, my compassion. Those things don't get left behind. They walk with you, steady and sure.
Time has a way of revealing whether your choices were rooted in fear or in truth. Months after everything unraveled, I could feel the difference in my body. My breathing was deeper. My thoughts were quieter. I wasn't bracing for impact anymore. Life had softened around the edges, not because it had become easier, but because I had stopped fighting myself. Daniel and I found a steadier footing. He came over for dinner sometimes, just the two of us, no expectations beyond sharing a meal. We laughed more than I thought we would. He asked about my watercolor class and listened, really listened, as I described the way colors bled into each other, how mistakes often made the painting more alive. He said that sounded like life. I agreed. One evening, he brought an old photo album. It was heavy, worn at the corners. We sat on the floor and turned the pages slowly. There we were, frozen in moments I'd almost forgotten. Birthday cakes, school plays, camping trips where the rain ruined everything and somehow made it better. He paused at a picture of his father, taken just months before we lost him. Daniel's voice wavered as he spoke about how much he missed having someone to measure himself against. I reminded him that love doesn't disappear when people do. It becomes a compass. Mara's name came up less and less, not because we avoided it, but because it stopped defining the space between us. Daniel told me they'd agreed on an amicable separation. There was no drama, no public spectacle, just two people acknowledging that they had wanted different things from the beginning. I felt a quiet sadness for them both. I also felt a relief that truth had finally been allowed to speak. As spring arrived, I volunteered to help organize a community fundraiser at the library. It was small, but it mattered. I coordinated schedules, reached out to donors, watched people come together for something larger than themselves. I realized how much I enjoyed contributing without being consumed. Purpose, I learned, doesn't require self-erasure. One afternoon, I ran into Mara unexpectedly at the grocery store. She looked thinner, less polished. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the past hovered between us. She spoke first. She said she hadn't known how to share space without controlling it. She said she was sorry for what she'd said, for the way she'd treated me. I listened. I thanked her for saying it. I didn't reopen old wounds. I didn't pretend we were something we weren't. I accepted the apology and let it be enough. Walking away, I felt lighter. Closure doesn't always come with reconciliation. Sometimes it comes with acknowledgement and release. That summer, I hosted a small gathering to celebrate my birthday. I hadn't done that in years. Friends filled my apartment with laughter and warmth. Daniel brought a cake he'd baked himself, lopsided and perfect. Ruth toasted to new beginnings. I looked around and realized that family isn't defined by who lives under your roof, but who honors your presence. Late that night, after everyone left, I sat alone with the quiet hum of contentment. I thought about the moment that it changed everything, the words spoken so carelessly, the choice I'd made not to fight back, but to step forward. I understood now that dignity doesn't need witnesses. It just needs consistency. I don't know what the future holds. None of us do. But I know this. I will never again stay where I am not respected. I will never confuse love with endurance, and I will always trust the quiet voice inside me that says when it's time to go. Leaving wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of one I could finally recognize as my own.
There's a moment after the dust settles when you start to recognize yourself again, not as who you were before the hurt, but as someone newly shaped by it. I felt that moment one quiet morning as I watered the plants on my balcony. They had grown fuller, greener, responding to steady care instead of urgency. I realized I had done the same. Daniel's separation became final in a way that was both painful and clarifying. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't rush to fill the space it left behind. He told me he was learning how to sit with discomfort without trying to solve it immediately. That told me more about his growth than any apology ever could. Sometimes maturity sounds like silence that isn't defensive. He asked me one afternoon how I knew when to leave the house that day, how I found the courage to walk away without knowing what would come next. I told him the truth, that courage wasn't what led me out the door. Exhaustion did, the kind that comes from shrinking yourself too long. Courage showed up later, once I realized I had survived the leaving. That seemed to settle something in him. He nodded slowly and said he was tired too, but for the first time it felt like the right kind of tired, the kind that precedes change. I became more intentional about my days. I set routines that felt nourishing instead of obligatory. Morning walks, afternoon reading, evenings where I allowed myself to do nothing without guilt. I stopped measuring my worth by how useful I was to others. That took practice. Old habits don't loosen their grip easily. But every time I chose rest over proving myself, I felt stronger. At the library, one of the children asked me why the stories I read always had people leaving something behind. I smiled and told them that sometimes stories need room to grow. The child nodded as if that made perfect sense. Children often understand truths adults complicate. I received a letter from the family who bought my old house. They wanted to thank me for taking such good care of it. They said the neighbors spoke warmly of me, that the house felt loved. I read the letter twice, then placed it in my journal. I didn't feel loss. I felt continuity. Ruth and I planned another trip together, something modest but meaningful. We talked about aging, about independence, about the strange freedom that comes when you stop performing roles assigned long ago. She said she admired me. I laughed, then realized she meant it. That stayed with me. Daniel invited me to dinner at his new place, a small apartment, sparsely furnished, honest. He cooked nervously, asking questions about seasoning, timing. I answered without taking over. When we sat down to eat, he thanked me for letting him fail without judgment. I told him that was trust, not distance. As the evening wound down, he said something I hadn't expected. He said watching me leave had changed how he understood love. That love wasn't about possession or proximity, but about respect. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do for someone is to stop rescuing them. I felt tears rise then, not from pain, but from pride. I know now that what I walked away from didn't define me. What I carried forward did.
my values, my boundaries, my capacity for compassion without self-sacrifice. Those are things no one can take from you unless you hand them over. If there is a lesson in my story, it's this: you don't have to stay where you were diminished just because you once belonged there. Homes can change, families can shift, but your sense of self must remain intact. I didn't leave alone. I left with clarity, with allies, with the quiet power of knowing my worth, and that, I've learned, is more than enough.
There are seasons in life that don't announce themselves until they're already passing. I realized I was in one of those seasons when I began waking up without the familiar weight in my chest. No replaying conversations, no bracing for the next disappointment. Just a steady presence, a sense of being rooted where I stood. It wasn't happiness in the loud, celebratory sense. It was something deeper, contentment that didn't need witnesses. Daniel and I grew closer in ways we never had when he lived under my roof. Our conversations weren't rushed or defensive. We spoke like two adults who respected each other's boundaries. He asked my opinion without expecting agreement. I offered it without attachment to the outcome. That balance felt new and precious. It told me that something healthy was finally taking shape between us. One afternoon, he told me he'd started therapy on his own, not because he was falling apart, but because he wanted to understand why he had ignored discomfort for so long. He said he was learning how easily love can turn into appeasement when you're afraid of losing someone. I listened quietly, recognizing pieces of my younger self in his words. Healing, I've learned, often echoes across generations. I spent more time with people who saw me clearly. Friends from the library invited me to join a weekly walking group. We moved slowly, talked freely, shared stories without competition. No one interrupted, no one dismissed. That kind of community doesn't demand performance, it thrives on presence. Occasionally, someone would ask about my son, about the wedding that never quite became what it promised. I answered simply. I didn't dramatize or defend. I spoke the truth without bitterness. It surprised people. It surprised me, too. Letting go of the need to be understood by everyone is a freedom I wish I'd found earlier. There were moments when grief surfaced unexpectedly. A song on the radio, the smell of fresh paint, a memory of my late husband and the plans we once made for our later years. I didn't push those moments away. I let them sit with me. Loss, I realized, doesn't vanish. It transforms. It becomes a companion that teaches you how to cherish what remains. One evening, Daniel asked me if I ever regretted leaving the house, if there were days I wished I'd stayed and fought harder. I thought about it carefully. I told him I didn't regret leaving. I regretted waiting so long to believe that my peace mattered. He nodded, absorbing that truth the way you absorb something you know will shape your future decisions. I received another message from Mara months later. She had started a new job in a different city. She said the distance had given her perspective. She thanked me again, this time without defensiveness. I replied kindly. I wished her well. And then I closed that chapter fully, without ceremony, without resentment. My days became fuller, not dizzier. I painted more. I wrote letters by hand. I learned how to enjoy my own company without distraction. There is a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are enough for yourself. It changes how you move through the world. People sense it. They respond differently. I began mentoring younger women at the library, women juggling caregiving, careers, expectations that felt heavier than they admitted. I didn't tell them what to do. I told them what I had learned, that love should expand you, not compress you, that boundaries are not punishments, they are instructions for how to treat you. Sometimes, late at night, I think back to the moment those words were spoken to me. This house is wasted on you. I see now that they were never about the house. They were about control, about measuring worth by utility. I'm grateful I recognized that when I did. The life I live now is quieter, but it's honest. It fits me. I don't need grand gestures or vindication. I have something better, a sense of self that doesn't waver when challenged. If I could speak to the version of myself who stood in that kitchen, stunned and silent, I would tell her this: you are not walking away from love, you are walking toward yourself. And that journey, though lonely at first, leads to a place of deep and lasting peace. As the year turned, I found myself thinking less about what had happened and more about what had changed inside me because of it. The sharp edges of memory had softened, not because I had forgotten, but because I had integrated the experience into who I was becoming. It no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a lesson I carried with care. Daniel invited me to spend a weekend with him in early spring. He had moved again, this time into a place that felt more like him, warm, modest, intentional. We cooked together, falling into an easy rhythm. At one point, he stopped and looked at me, smiling softly, and said, "You seem lighter." I told him I felt lighter. That was the truth. We talked late into the night, not about crises or plans, but about meaning, about how easy it is to confuse endurance with love, about how leaving can be an act of generosity to yourself and to others. Daniel said watching me choose myself had given him permission to do the same. That was more vindication than I ever needed. I returned home and felt a quiet pride in the life I'd built, not because it was impressive, but because it was mine. I had learned to listen to my body, to notice when something felt wrong before it became unbearable. That awareness was a gift I didn't intend to squander. One afternoon, I was asked to speak at a small community gathering about resilience. I hesitated at first. I wasn't sure I wanted to frame my life as a lesson. But when I stood in front of those familiar faces, I didn't speak about betrayal or revenge. I spoke about self-respect, about the moment you realize that staying cost you more than leaving. The room was quiet in that attentive way that tells you people are hearing themselves in your words. Afterward, a woman approached me, tears in her eyes. She said she'd been living in a situation that made her feel small, and she didn't know how to leave. I didn't tell her what to do. I told her she wasn't wrong for wanting peace. Sometimes permission is the most powerful thing you can give. I continued my routines, my walks, my painting, my reading. The ordinary days felt rich. I no longer waited for something to happen. I was already living. Daniel and I marked anniversaries differently now, not weddings or milestones, but moments of honesty. We celebrated his decision to take a solo trip, his choice to set boundaries at work, my first small art exhibit at the library. These were quieter victories, but they felt more durable. I understand now that empowerment doesn't come from being proven right. It comes from being aligned, from choosing a life that doesn't require constant defense, from knowing when to speak and when to step back. The house, the words, the rupture, they were catalysts, not definitions. They pushed me toward a version of myself that had been waiting patiently, unnoticed, until I finally made space. I don't resent the path that brought me here. I honor it. Every misstep taught me something. Every boundary strengthened me. Every departure clarified what truly mattered. When I look ahead, I don't see emptiness. I see openness, possibility that doesn't demand I sacrifice my dignity, love that arrives without conditions. And I know with a calm certainty that no matter where I live or who walks beside me, my life will never again be wasted on anyone who cannot see its worth.
There's a moment, often unnoticed, when a chapter truly closes. Not with a dramatic goodbye, but with the quiet understanding that you no longer need to revisit it to make sense of who you are. I felt that moment one morning as I sat by my window, watching the city wake up. Nothing extraordinary was happening, and that was the point. My life had become something steady, predictable in the best way. I woke, I moved, I created, I connected. I no longer measured my days by how much I gave away, but by how honestly I lived them. That shift changed everything. Daniel and I settled into something that felt earned. He visited without obligation. He called without guilt. Our conversations were no longer about repairing damage, but about sharing growth. One afternoon, he told me he had started dating again, slowly, thoughtfully. He said he was paying attention to how he felt around someone, not just how much he wanted them to stay. I smiled and told him that awareness would serve him well. It already had. He asked me if I ever felt lonely. I answered carefully. I told him there were moments of solitude, yes, but loneliness, no. Loneliness comes from being unseen, and I had never felt more seen by myself. The years have a way of rearranging your priorities if you let them. I stopped chasing harmony at the cost of truth. I stopped negotiating my worth. I stopped mistaking endurance for virtue. In their place grew discernment, peace, and a self-trust that no one else could grant or revoke. Occasionally, someone new would hear my story and say, "I don't know how you stayed so calm." I would tell them I wasn't calm at first. I was hurt. I was stunned. Calm came later, after I chose not to abandon myself, after I realized that dignity doesn't require permission. The house is gone now, but the meaning I gave it remains intact. It was never about the structure. It was about what I allowed within it. And when that space stopped honoring me, I honored myself instead. If there is a legacy I hope to leave, it isn't property or possessions. It's the example that love should never ask you to disappear, that walking away can be an act of courage, not failure, that self-respect is not a wall, but a foundation. I didn't leave alone. I left with truth beside me, with clarity guiding me, with allies who respected my boundaries, and with a future that no longer required me to beg for a place within it. When I think back to those words, "This house is wasted on you," I see them now for what they were, a misunderstanding of value. My life was never wasted. It was simply waiting for me to claim it fully. And I did.